August 24th was Independence Day in Ukraine. This year, the country had a special guest. Standing side by side with Vladimir Zelensky was our very own Mark Carney.
It's humbling to stand before so many courageous women and men who have devoted themselves to this great nation.
It's been 3.5 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it was Carney's first official visit to the country. The trip happened right after peace efforts by Donald Trump heated up, meeting with Putin in Alaska.
I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say.
Then cooled off as Russia continued to bombard Ukrainian territory.
New this morning, Russia attacked Ukraine overnight with a ballistic missile and dozens of drones.
Carney walked away from his visit promising more support to Ukraine and offering more than 2 billion Canadian dollars in additional military aid. Most notably, he didn't rule out Canadian boots on the ground.
Canada is under no illusions about the importance of your struggle. And you should have no doubts about the commitment of Canadians to your cause.
But even though Canadian troops haven't touched down in Ukraine yet, the war showed up at Toronto's Pearson airport.
The Antonov is a Soviet-era military plane, and that particular Antonov has been sitting on the tarmac at Pearson Airport for more than 3 years now.
This plane has become a defining test of Canada's sanctions against Russia and beyond, one that could set a global precedent and has the whole world watching.
In terms of seizing something physical like an airplane, I've not been able to find a comparable case.
This episode, I'm talking to Zak Vescera. He's a reporter for the Investigative Journalism Foundation based in Vancouver. His beat? Financial crime.
While I was just phoning people up, someone mentioned to me and just said, you should really look into what the heck is happening with this plane.
So he looked into the plane and combed through more than 1,000 pages of documents from the federal court.
After scouring through all of that, and after my eyes started hurting, we began calling up as many folks working in the space as possible, trying to ferret out what happened.
So, what did happen? And why is the whole world watching me eat my Subway at gate A52? Let's get into it. You know, not too long ago, I found myself at Pearson Airport. I was going on vacation, and as I was pulling up to the airport, I saw this plane. And it was not a regular plane. It was a giant plane, a plane that also seemed like it had seen better days. It looked like it didn't belong there. What plane did I see, Zach?
The plane that you're talking about is called an Antonov Model 100. The Antonov is a Soviet-era military plane, and that particular Antonov has been sitting on the tarmac at Pearson Airport for more than 3 years now, essentially marooned.
A Soviet-era cargo plane. What the fuck is that doing at Pearson Airport?
Truly, what are any of us doing at Pearson Airport? But the Soviet era cargo plane that is there was basically in February 2022. It touched down at Pearson carrying a massive shipment of COVID-19 rapid tests. We all remember those.
The good old days.
The good old days.
Did we ask for a Russian plane to show up with thousands of COVID-19 tests? How did it get here?
The plane's arrival here isn't super unusual. It's owned by a company called Volga Dnepr Airlines, which is a Russian company that at one point and still has pretty global operations. The shipment of COVID-19 test kits it was bringing to Canada was actually being done for medical purposes, and it was contracted actually to do this. We actually, through court documents, know for a fact that the Canadian government even asked the Chinese government to expedite passage of this plane through Chinese customs. They literally asked the Chinese government and said, hey, make sure this plane doesn't run into any problems. And so, yeah, there wasn't anything unusual about it landing at Pearson and dropping off these COVID-19 rapid test kits. It had been paid to do that. It's a massive company that does this kind of work. What is definitely unusual, obviously, is what happened after that.
Maybe walk me through the day we found out that the plane was staying here. What happened?
So it touches down in late February 2022. And presumably the people, we don't know this for sure, but presumably the people who are flying this plane have no idea what exactly is about to ensue. But shortly after it touches the tarmac at Pearson, the COVID-19 tests are rolled out. Canada announces it's closing its airspace to Russian planes.
Europe and Canada shut their airspace to Russian aircraft in a bid to press Putin to end his invasion of Ukraine.
Which, because this plane is owned by Volga means it can't effectively take off. So at that point, the plane is in this kind of strange limbo. It's sitting here. No one questions who it belongs to, but it's not in a position where it's able to take off and return to Russia. Then, flash forward to 2023, Canada begins ramping up its sanctions against Russia. It begins specifically targeting businesses and individuals that it believes are tied to or related to the Russian regime. These are people like oligarchs who Canada accuses of profiting off the war in Ukraine or of assisting the invasion of Ukraine. One of those people is named Alexei Ivanovich Izaykin.
Who is this guy?
Alexei Ivanovich Izaykin is a Russian businessman who made his fortune in the aviation industry. He founded Volga quite some time ago. And he is, depending on who you ask, either a very successful businessman or what we would call an oligarch, someone who has very direct political influence and power in Russia and has direct connections to the Russian government. The Canadian government, certainly when sanctioning him and in court filings later, pointed out that he and his company have had several lucrative contracts with Russian governments, including some that might have abetted the war in Ukraine or allowed Russia to sidestep sanctions that are meant to suppress its war efforts. So Canada slaps sanctions on this guy and on Volga and basically says, look, you're related to this. We're now going to, sanction your business activities in Canada, and we might start to go after assets that you guys have here. And one of those assets, obviously, is this giant Antonov plane that is sitting at Pearson Airport. And perhaps because of the visibility of this asset, perhaps because it is a giant plane,
Massive.
The Canadian government, massive plane, the Canadian government announces its intention to formally seize the plane. Now, this is seize and forfeit ownership of the plane.
What does that mean, actually? Like, you're gonna take my plane? Like, what's that?
It's a really great question, and there is a bit of a distinction here. When the government seizes an asset, it basically just means that they're taking it. It doesn't mean that they're assuming ownership of it, but they're holding on to it. This happens all the time in what are called civil forfeiture proceedings, where governments, provinces usually try to basically grab criminal assets that they believe are the proceeds of crime. And at that point, it's sort of like they're holding on to it and they say, okay, we're keeping this because we're pretty sure something's not right. You know what I mean? You can imagine if there's a giant stack of what they suspect is drug money, they're holding on to it. Forfeiture goes a step farther. Forfeiture is when they go to the courts and they convince a judge that, yeah, this is something that is the direct result of a crime and the state should be allowed to take it. And in this situation, there's not a crime that's being alleged per se in terms of a break and enter or drug dealing or anything like that. They're basically saying, yeah, these individuals are sanctioned by Canada. The sanctions are legitimate. We should be able to take legal ownership of this plane. It's a very formalized court process that essentially is a way of just taking a giant aircraft, right?
To me, it sounds basically like the Canadian government is trying to steal this plane.
I mean, steal is an interesting choice of words. The Canadian government would certainly take the position that this is a totally lawful sanction, and this is something that they are doing, that this is something that they have the government power to do, they have the legal right to do, and that is just in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Certainly, Mr. Azrieh and Volga Airlines say this is stealing. And
I was just going to say, doesn't he want his plane back? If that was my plane, I'd want my Soviet-era plane back.
Well, it's actually really funny because Mr. Azakin, after the invasion of Ukraine began, has actually stepped back from Volga Dnepr Airlines and in court filings has said, oh, I don't have anything to do with this company or this plane anymore. Take me off the sanctions list. But Volga Dnepr Airlines definitely says, yes, that's our plane. Give us back our plane. This is stealing. And they've even gone to an international tribunal, essentially, arguing that Canada owes them as much as $100 million for this plane. They've even alleged that the plane isn't receiving adequate maintenance on the tarmac. You pointed out that it looks pretty run down. The Canadian government says it is taking care of the plane, but in some court filings, Volga Dnepr claims that it hasn't received adequate maintenance, that is basically sitting here deteriorating on the tarmac at Pearson. So yes, the company's perspective is absolutely that Canada is trying to steal their plane, and they would very much like it back. Thank you very much.
So do they fight over it?
They are fighting over it.
Talk to me a little bit about that. Yeah, the big fight over the Russian plane.
So the fight starts with listing Azakin and Volga Dnepr on the sanctions list, putting them on this big list of entities that Canada says are helping Russia in its war effort and should be sanctioned. The first thing that the company and Mr. Azakin do is they try to get off that list. They go through a long appeal to the Minister of Foreign Affairs here in Canada, basically saying, hey, we actually aren't related to the invasion of Ukraine at all. This is an illegitimate sanction. You're messing up by putting us on this list. Mr. Azakin even sends in an affidavit where he says, that, yeah, I have nothing to do with Russia's war in Ukraine. And by the way, we've never provided services to the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is essentially, I guess you could describe it loosely, as a Russian paramilitary or mercenary organization that has been, I would say, very prominent in its invasion of mainland Ukraine. And folks within the Wagner Group, leading members of the Wagner Group are very prominent boosters of Vladimir Putin's invasion and have been a big part of the fighting that's been done on the ground. So Wagner is absolutely tied up in the invasion of Ukraine. There's no question about it. But Mr. Azakin says, I have nothing to do with Wagner. I have nothing to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just sort of openly denying that there's any kind of involvement there.
Did we even ask about the Wagner Group? Like, how'd that come up?
It definitely caught my attention because Canada does mention that in its when it put out this notice that it was sanctioning a bunch of people, it did say, yeah, we're sanctioning these people because they provide aviation services and some of them have connections to Wagner, but they never specifically accused Azakin of supporting Wagner. So him denying it in an affidavit is perhaps interesting. And Volga Dnepr Airlines says the same thing. They point to the fact they have what's called basically a peaceful carrier policy, which means that they don't export or move military arms. They say that they're only involved in sort of typical commercial activities. And they basically argue, yeah, hey, minister, you should take us off this sanctions list. Now, because of court filings that we were able to obtain, we know that Canadian officials wrote rebuttals to this. In their rebuttals, they basically argue, no, we're pretty sure these guys are connected to the invasion of Ukraine. They point out the fact that Volga Dnepr has held, some pretty significant contracts with different Russian government entities. They point to some reporting that has found that Volga Dnepr might be assisting in so-called air bridges that are helping move goods into Russia that are, otherwise under sanction, basically trying to sidestep those sanctions to keep the war effort going. And they essentially accuse Mr. Azakin of trying to pull one up over them. They say that his move to step down from the company is essentially a fabrication, a way of deflecting attention, and that he still possibly has a very strong material and financial interest in this airline, accusing him of behaving kind of fraudulently, in other words. And very interestingly, in fact, they also, in this memorandum that they're writing for the minister, they write specifically that a positive order, that means keeping Azakin and Volga Dnepr on the sanctions list, would, quote, result in good media attention, end quote. So they're considering public optics here, too. They think it would look good to keep sanctions on these individuals and keep the pressure on. Unsurprisingly, the minister, the person who, formally approved the sanctions, decides to keep them on. Azakin and Volga Dnepr go to the Federal Court of Appeal to try and reverse that decision. That so far has not been successful. Didn't work out for him. In the meantime, the federal government has begun the formal civil forfeiture process. So they've now gone to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, and they are now using this mechanism that is usually used to seize things like drug money or the proceeds of crime. And they are now trying to use it to seize an actual airplane. And they've speculated openly that they might even gift it to the Ukrainian government, kind of in a final show of irony.
This just sounds like it's out of a movie. And then to add all, like to put it all together, not only are they going to take this plane, they're going to give this plane, or they say they're going to give this plane, to Ukraine. What do we know about this gift to Ukraine? Like, where did that come from? What more details do we know about that? Because that, to me, is like the icing on the cake of this entire story.
It's really intriguing. And to fully answer your question, Noor, we don't know a whole lot about that gift. This is something that was floated very openly by the Canadian government in 2023 when they talked about seizing the plane. The Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, made comments about it, but we don't really know. And the Ukrainian government obviously responded enthusiastically, saying, "Yeah, we'll take that Russian plane." But we don't really know anything about that step. Like we're still at the process where we're fighting over the ability to actually forfeit this plane. We really have no clue what happens beyond that. We don't know if the Ukrainian government still wants the plane, if they're interested in it. We also don't know how fundamentally useful the plane will be. It is a giant air carrier. One imagines you can find a purpose for that. This is a whole world of unknowns.
Can it even fly? I mean, they were just complaining about the maintenance not being up to date, so I'm not sure that thing can even get out of here.
Every indication we have is that the plane is still airworthy and that it's able to fly. No one to me has suggested when I went around asking for comment that this plane was now like unusable or scrap material. And it is a Soviet era plane, right? It's got a few decades on it already, for sure. Yeah, but it is massive and was working very well quite recently.
I would never get on that plane. It does not look safe.
I am not, you know what, that makes one of us. I want to fly on the plane. I feel like I know too much about this plane. I feel like I need to experience it. I would accept, if anyone's offering me a ride on the Antonov, I will take it.
I love that. I will not. I will take pictures from the tarmac for you. Has this happened anywhere else in the world? Like, is this the first we're hearing of something like, I don't know, seizing of Russian assets?
It is the first time that the Canadian government has ever attempted to do anything like this under a sanctions regime. It is totally novel. And experts in this field, folks who watch these kind of sanctions regimes very closely, say that this will be probably a precedent-setting case. A lot of other Western countries that have levied similar sanctions against Russia are probably watching this closely to see how effective it is and to consider whether they might try to undertake their own forfeiture efforts.
And what are their odds? Like, is it actually possible for us to not only keep the plane in Canada? Is that doable for real?
It, in theory, if you look at the letter of the law, is entirely doable. The way that the Russia regulations are written basically should empower the Canadian government to seek forfeiture of these items. Of this plane. But this is sort of a new ballpark. It is a really interesting and complicated legal fight over a very massive and visible thing with deep international implications. And I think that's why the story is so intriguing is this isn't, for people going through Lessard Pearson Airport, this isn't some strange hypothetical legalese battle happening in a faraway place. It's affecting a giant thing that is literally kind of looking you in the face and that refuses to kind of be ignored. And that reminds us that this conflict on the other side of the world does have Canadian connections.
Has this happened anywhere else in the world?
In terms of seizing something physical, like an airplane, I've not been able to find a comparable case of a government coming in and trying to enact the legal forfeiture of something like an airplane or like a physical asset. And that does kind of raise for me, really interesting legal questions too about how far Western countries might go. Do they start going after properties owned by Russian business people or companies they believe are connected to the invasion of Ukraine, right? Famously, London has been a destination for some time for Russian oligarchs. Does the government of the United Kingdom begin seizing flats and penthouses? All of this is really interesting to consider. And I think it ultimately comes down to a combination of political will and whether it is actually legally feasible to do this.
Sounds kind of precedent setting. I'm sure lots of countries are going to look towards Canada and the decisions we make to decide what what they're going to do on their soil.
This sort of the actual seeking forfeiture of the plane feels like kind of a new step. Like that's actually like a pretty extreme go with sanctions. Normally sanctions just say, hey, you're not allowed to be here. And we might like grab your stuff and seize it if you're here. To actually seek the forfeiture of something is a bigger step for sure.
It really sounds to me that the sanction game may be fundamentally changing in a really impactful way. But I'm also having this other thought, which is the changing game of money and assets. We all know that cryptocurrency and digital currencies are on the rise, and I'm sure oligarchs, people who have been sanctioned, do use this as a means of kind of like hiding their money or avoiding, kind of skirting these sanctions. Aren't we in a new world anyway?
We know for a fact that sanctioned countries, not just Russia, are finding ways to try and move around those sanctions. And individuals in those countries are trying to find ways to move money outside of the traditional banking and finance system. FinTrack, Canada's financial intelligence agency that I mentioned earlier, has put out memos acknowledging the different ways that Russia is trying to evade these sanctions. And one of them, you're right, is cryptocurrency, is trying to move money through unregistered or sort of dubious exchanges that aren't going to be reporting these transactions or looking too closely at them. That's just like crypto, I think, is just one of the many mechanisms you can use to try to launder money or sidestep sanctions. It obviously gets a lot of attention. And I can say personally that I am looking into cryptocurrency exchanges that have possible connections to Russia.
Have you seen anything or come across anything that you would like to share that you want to tell us?
I'm going to kindly refuse to not scoop myself. I think in the next 2 weeks we will have published something that will be relevant to this.
Okay, beautiful. That's fair. I tried. I tried to ask.
No, fair shot. Yeah. The key part of the story now is the civil forfeiture proceeding at the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. You should be paying attention to when the parties actually file their arguments in court and when they actually go to litigate this. The result of that court battle in Ontario will decide the fate of this airplane and could be essentially a watershed moment for sanctions enforcement in the West.
And when do we have a sense of timeline?
Everything about this has taken longer than the people involved expected. We do not yet know when those parties will file their arguments and when they will actually litigate this in court.
So for now, the plane stays here.
For now, the plane stays here.
Where can people find your work?
You can find my work at theijf.org. And please feel free to follow us and support our work. We love doing cool investigative projects like this one.
Great. Zak, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
There's always so much political news to keep up with, but Sam, our Ottawa correspondent, is off on his Euroboys summer trip.
Nothing beats a Jet2 holiday.
We talked about sanctions in this episode, and I really want to tell you about another one. This one's pretty interesting.
A Canadian is among 4 judges on the International Criminal Court now facing sanctions from the U.S. government. Kimberly Prost.
Why? Well, the State Department accused her and a few other judges of greenlighting investigations that Washington didn't like.
The State Department today said Kimberly Prost was sanctioned for, quote, ruling to authorize the ICC's investigation into U.S. personnel in Afghanistan.
But she wasn't the only ICC judge targeted. Judges from France, Fiji, and Senegal also got hit with sanctions. And the U.S. linked those to the ICC's more recent move to investigate Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the court, the International Criminal Court, a, quote, national security threat, end quote. But this is the really interesting part of the story. After sanctions against Judge Prost, the Canadian judge were announced, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, published a tweet on X and called the move disgraceful. He added that attacks on ICC staff by Russia, Israel, and the United States are intended to, quote, weaken and intimidate the international system, end quote. And then he deleted it. He deleted the post, and since then, we've had no official statement from the Canadian government over these sanctions. And these sanctions aren't just an attack on the ICC, they're an attack on her. Prost will have any U.S. assets frozen. She could have difficulty accessing financial services in Canada. She could face challenges working with Canadian banks and airlines who might be reluctant to give services to someone under American sanctions, given most of them do business in the United States. So it's something I'm keeping my eye on, and I think you should too.
Immigration. Let's talk about it.
We've finally got data from the Carney government on permanent and temporary resident trends after being accused for weeks by the Conservatives of withholding the data. What we know for certain is that the number of new temporary residents, think international students, foreign workers, refugee claimants, actually went down in the first half of 2025 compared to the same time last year. Let's take international students for one. They dropped big time. From January to June of 2025, only about 36,000 new students arrived. Last year, in the same period, that number was 125,000. The same story is with the work permits. Just over 119 new permits issued this year compared to 245,000 last year. And then there's the asylum claims, which have been under the microscope ever since Trump cracked down on immigration and after the announcement of Carney's border bill, Bill C-2. There's been around 57,000 new claims in the first half of this year, down from 91,000 in 2024. But here's the interesting part. The backlog is still ballooning. The total number of immigration files in the system went from about 1.9 million in March to over 2.2 million by the end of July. So yes, there are fewer immigrants coming into the country, but more and more people are stuck waiting for an answer. I want to do a much deeper dive on this topic. It's something I'm personally really interested in. If you want specific questions answered, please email me at noor@canadaland.com. That's it for this week on The Hill. That's been This Week in Canadian Politics. If you enjoyed this episode, much like I did, you should leave us a comment. Tell us you liked it. Leave us a like if you really liked it. You can subscribe. You can hit the bell. There's lots of things you could do. At this point in the video, you can also support us at canadaland.com/join. And I asked this last video, but give us feedback on these videos. What do you like? What do you not like? Email me at noor@canadaland.com. And I'll see you later.